Welcome to week 6 already. How crazy is that? Midterms are almost over, and as promised, here is Chapter 17, Fluid and Electrolytes. As you can see from the reflection in my glasses, it's a somewhat sunny day out there today. So, fluid and electrolytes. Shall we get started? I do wish that we were doing this in person, but this is what we've got so far. So let's bring this up. Share the screen. And go away, toolbar. Let's get going. Fluid and electrolyte balance. We are an amazing machine. We have electrical control and electrolytes. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. And fluid. Lots and lots of water within our cells and outside our cells that allows our cells to function and carry on these weird little processes that we call life. So let's review. Homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is a dynamic process, constantly adjusting to stimuli. Okay, when you think about it, and as we will go into here with fluid balance, constant adjustments, fluid moving in and out of cells, fluid loss, fluid being replenished. As you recall from cellular respiration, we are making water just by living and breathing, and oxygen and glucose getting into cells and being burned for energy. So constant adjustment to internal and external stimulus. Enzymes, hormones, nutrients, all of those things that are required for normal body processes, as well as getting rid of the wastes of those processes. Now, as we've covered previously, C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields. Okay, the byproducts of this are CO2 and water. Right, glucose and oxygen. Burn it for energy, produces CO2 and water. Those are byproducts. The CO2 is really a waste product of the reaction, and we have to get rid of that. If we don't get rid of CO2, builds up in the body, and when CO2 dissolves in water, it becomes carbonic acid, which then creates an acidic environment inside the body. We run a little bit to the basic side. Homeostasis, that dynamic process, creating balance, right, requires the movements of fluids. So let's look at feedback. Negative feedback. Body reverses an original stimulus, all right, to again put us back in balance. We eat. Food is digested, glucose absorbed, blood sugar increases. Body's response to this is to release insulin, right? Gets that glucose into the cells. Life is grand. Cells are producing energy. That's all good. And with that, when the insulin is released and the glucose is getting into the cells, right, we got this little imbalance here. As blood sugar gets high with the release of glucose, things come back to normal, to a balance. Positive feedback. Think of contractions in childbirth, or some of you may experience this if you are cyclical vomiters, meaning once you get started, you have a hard time stopping the act of vomiting, of getting rid of the toxins or the too many Jägermeisters, just keeps on going until there's nothing left. And long past the time that there's nothing left for some. All right. In the feedback loops, nervous and endocrine systems, these are the major systems that that are involved with this. When you think, well, endocrine system, let's look up the page there to the insulin response to increased blood sugar. As we remember from last week, what gland or what organ releases insulin would be the beta cells in the pancreas and the islets of Langerhans, or the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, better way to say it. Okay. Nervous system. So we have various receptors in the body, baroreceptors that measure pressure. In response to low pressure in the vasculature, body is triggered to retain water to increase the volume. And that's a couple of basic examples here. Body fluids themselves. So we have two types of body fluids, ICF and ECF, intracellular and extracellular. Intra meaning inside the cells, extracellular, outside the cells. Now, extracellular fluid, as you can see here, is broken down into two main categories: the interstitial fluid. Interstitial, this is the space in between the cells, and intravascular, so blood plasma. Okay. Interstitial and intravascular are both ECF. ICF is actually the larger amount of fluid within the body. Intracellular fluid, about, let me move my melon out of here, about 1/2 to 2/3 of the total body fluid. So we're better than half of this fluid in your body is inside the cells. ECF, about 1/3 to 1/2 in there. You know, the other piece of that is extracellular, in between the cells and in the vasculature. So let's look at composition. All right, body fluid composition. Right. Blood, plasma, and lymph. Now we're looking at percentage of body weight, different than percentage of volume, right? So percentage of body weight, your fluids themselves, about 60% of your body weight. So to piggyback on Karen's teaching in Nursing 201, when we start talking about nutrition and diets, this is where, and I know you've seen it, some of you have probably engaged in one of these before, this the latest and greatest diet being pimped by whatever celebrity happens to be trending on Twitter this week. Twitter, aptly named, where I lost 10 pounds in the first 2 weeks. Yeah, man, it was pretty much all fluid that you lost. Okay, so about 60% of total body weight being fluid. Really easy to lose weight if you're getting rid of fluid. Not so easy to keep up proper function of the cells if you're losing fluid. So blood plasma, about 5% of body weight. Where do we lose this fluid from? Okay, where would we lose it? Through the skin, through sweating. Recall that sweating, sorry, I gotta adjust my position here and not knock over the desk. So sweat is one of the ways in which you regulate body temperature, again with homeostasis. We'll come back to the lungs. Kidneys, all right, kidneys make sense, right? You are producing urine. Urine contains a lot of water. This is one way in which we get rid of excess fluids, or getting rid of wastes, which then takes the fluids with it, and then we have to replenish those fluids. The less obvious place where we lose body fluid is from the lungs. From the sweat and from the lungs, these are what we would call insensible losses, meaning it can't be easily and readily measured. Through GI tract or kidneys, that's easy to measure. You just measure the output. But through the skin and then the lungs, that's much harder. It's much harder. Obviously not well caffeinated enough. Hang on. Mountain Dew, not antifreeze. It is much harder to measure these. The lungs, when you consider this, like, I lose water when I breathe. Well, yes. Think about, go to the bathroom, breathe on the mirror. The mirror fogs up. Okay, that is water vapor in your breath. Interstitial fluid. Kick to this next piece. 15% of body weight's thereabouts. Okay, so blood and plasma, 5%. Interstitial fluid, 15% of body weight. Wow, I mean, 3 times the amount of fluid in between the cells as there is in the vasculature. Yep. And then finally, intracellular fluid, about 40% of body weight. Okay. Fluid inside the cells, which, when you think about the number of cells that compose the human body, this makes a bit more sense because they are filled with fluid. So 50 to 60% of total body weight just in fluid. Water, electrolytes, and then floating in that as well are proteins, blood cells, ECF. Good look at that again. Okay. ECF, extracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid is the most important fluid in regulating fluid balance. Okay, ECF. Right. If we were in class, I would be stomping my foot 3 times right now. Most important fluid. Okay. So let's start. Bring my cursor over here. So let's start with homeostasis. Right. We're looking at sodium concentration. Receptors measure sodium concentration, and if it is within the normal range, life is grand. But now let's take up here. Oh, darn it. So we start here. Homeostasis disturbed. Sodium concentration gets increased, meaning either there's too much sodium, too much extra sodium, or some loss of fluid. The osmoreceptors are stimulated because of that. And remember that hormone, ADH, antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, okay, increases the release of ADH. Also triggers the thirst center in the hypothalamus. Boom. Decreases urinary water loss. The thirst center increases water gain because you're thirsty, you drink. Yeah. But additional water dilutes the extracellular fluid. The volume is increased, and the sodium concentration, instead of being high, comes back to normal. Along with this, we have the effects of the RAAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which helps to regulate blood pressure through retention or loss of sodium, and the release of ANP, which triggers this system as well. Now let's pop over here. All right, so here we are back to homeostasis, and the sodium content is decreased. You have excess fluid on board, which decreases the concentration. Then it inhibits the osmoreceptors, decreases the release of ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, and decreases the thirst sensation, which causes kidneys to not retain sodium. And as sodium is being ejected, you're losing water loss. Decrease the gain of water. The sodium reabsorbed, but the water loss concentrates the bloodstream again. So it was down here. And sodium concentration comes back up, and here we are again in homeostasis. Simple, right? We do it all the time. We don't even know that it's happening. Again, this is where we're talking about I am with you today, guys. It has been a little stressful this week. Let me stop here for a second. Oop. Wrong button. So we've reached homeostasis again, and it's happening all the time. Right? Don't even know it's happening. Boy, I lost that one. Oh, my bad. All right. Dehydration. Let's see. So with dehydration, we have a fluid volume deficit, meaning we don't have sufficient fluid volume. Right? It was here, now it's down here. Dehydration. Water output is greater than the intake. Causes may include one or all disturbance in electrolytes, okay, prolonged sun exposure. Let's just take these pieces. So prolonged sun exposure. This makes sense, right? Out in the sunshine, you get hot, you sweat. What is sweat packing a lot of? Fluid. Excessive exercise. Well, if you're doing it right, you sweat. Diarrhea. As you are losing all this through the GI tract, you're losing a lot of fluid there. Vomiting the same way. Burns. So let's peel back to first term with the integumentary system. Right? And burns. Intact skin keeps the bad things out and the juicy stuff in, because we are made of juicy stuff, as you recall. In the case of burns, where that outer layer is decreased, not only do we have, or is impaired, I should say, not only do we have a wide opening to lose fluid, but we also have the normal fluid loss that's happening during the healing process as the capillaries are opening up to get these fluids that contain the proteins and the other pieces needed to heal to the site of the injury. So that's kind of a double whammy there. Inappropriate use of diuretics. Oh my, does this happen? It does, and for weight loss. Malnutrition. Malnutrition is another piece that that can cause dehydration. Excessive fasting, and then anorexia or bulimia. Now, I want to take a moment to hit these words here. Anorexia. When we say anorexia, generally we think anorexia nervosa, the psychological condition. Anorexia may mean that you just are not eating anything. This can happen with chronic disease or acute disease, where you do not feel good. If you don't feel good, you don't want to eat. If you're not eating or drinking, you're running the risk of dehydration. With bulimia, You have the binge and the purge. You have the vomiting that can lose fluids. Excessive fasting, so not taking anything in. Anyone who's ever had a scheduled procedure will know what this is like. Nothing by mouth after midnight. My procedure's not till 3 in the afternoon. Too bad. Okay, that's not excessive fasting. Excessive fasting would be going on for days. So I wish I could claim this one. As the plasma volume decreases, you have dehydration. So when you're looking at labs for dehydration, you will find that the hematocrit increases, because the hematocrit is the percentage of dissolved or suspended things in blood plasma, and the sodium will increase. Now let's hit the flip side. We had dehydration, now we have overhydration. Weirdly enough, overhydration is an excess of water in the body, where dehydration is a deficiency of water in the body, okay? So to maintain fluid balance, daily output and intake should be relatively equal. But how do we measure that? Okay, so we've talked before about the product of cellular respiration. As we are sitting here, we are making water. So that's the metabolism. That's about 10%. Daily, on average, you make about 250 mils of water in your food, right? Roughly 750 mils of water, or 30%. We'll just go with percentages here. And then the beverages that you drink, about 60% of that is your average intake of water. Going out, you lose water in feces, in sweat, other insensible losses, and obviously urine output. So that is overhydration, right? We got excess of water in the body, right? We see how it comes in, we see how it goes out. Now, what things could impair the outflow of water from the body, or impair the loss of fluids? Renal disease is one that comes right to mind. If your kidneys are not working and are not producing urine, you're not losing the fluid. Other pieces that may come into this are cardiovascular diseases like chronic heart failure, which are not producing sufficient flow to the kidneys, or not draining fluids from the systemic circulation sufficiently to get through to the kidneys and get lost that way. These can also cause retention of water. Medications can cause retention of water. Increased sodium intake is another piece that can cause retention of water. Right? Edema is the excess accumulation of fluid in the interstitial, so the space between the cells, right? This is also what we refer to as third spacing. All right, so to put that into a little bit of perspective, the first space we have is where? Inside the cell, intracellular. The second space we have for fluids is intravascular. The third space is interstitial, hence we call it third spacing. Causes of edema. Might want to become really familiar with these, all right? Increased capillary pressure. We talked about heart failure before. We're getting ready to get into cardiovascular, and I am ever so excited, and I'm probably going to have to record these on campus so that I can have a big whiteboard. But increased capillary pressure. So the heart is a pump. It's actually two pumps in one. and it draws from circulation and outputs to the next one. So in the case of heart failure, the pump is not working well. It's not drawing from the spot upstream, and that is where the edema will manifest. If it's left-sided heart failure, the left side of the heart draws from the lungs, and if it's not drawing well, then fluid will back up into the lungs. If it's right-sided heart failure, it's not drawing from the body as well, and fluid will back up there and cause edema in the systemic circulation. Right? So other things that can cause edema: decreased osmotic pressure, right? Overhydration. Think about, there was I think it was the Xbox One when it was coming out, and a VJ or DJ at I think it was a Seattle station, or maybe it was a Vancouver station, had been given some Xbox Ones to give away, and they had it was a contest. It was a water drinking contest, and one of the contestants died trying to win the Xbox One for her kids, or maybe it was one of the gaming systems anyway. And it was due to overhydration, caused what was called water intoxication, because water, too much of it, can be toxic to tissues. Inflammation can cause edema. Now, as you remember, I'm a big one on inflammation. Be very familiar with that. So, inflammation can cause edema. There's an insult to the body. The body responds by making the capillaries expand to let out the white blood cells and the components needed for healing. And along with that comes water, so you have localized edema. Or there is an injury to the body that's maybe not open, but you still have the inflammatory response, and therein comes edema again. And then, last but not least, obstruction of lymphatic flow, or lymphedema. So when you think about the blood and lymphatic system all the way back, right, you have your arterial side, you have your venous side of the vasculature, and then up in the center of that, sorry, I don't have a third hand to demonstrate, up in the center of that is lymphatic system, which is sort of like the storm drain for the body. And when that outflow is blocked, either by filiary, which I believe in Bio 201 in the lymphatic, there were some great pictures on filiary worms blocking the lymphatic flow, call it elephantiasis, which then causes the fluid to build up, edema distal to the blockage. Another thing that can happen, though we're seeing it less and less in surgical patients, mastectomy patients, where a breast was removed, and they also took the lymph node, and that disturbed the lymphatic system. So these patients that had a radical mastectomy with the lymph node removal would get lymphedema in the limb that would normally be drained through that node. And very often what you'll see is those patients, they wear a compression sleeve over that arm to keep the fluids from backing up and causing edema. Treatment of edema, right? Monitor sodium intake and blood pressure. Little key here: water follows salt. Salt is sodium chloride, but so water follows salt. With increased sodium comes increased water retention, which can cause increased blood pressure. Okay. Encourage the intake of foods with potassium. In general, now if they're on a potassium-sparing diuretic, we may not want to do this. But This can decrease the amount of sodium that the body's retaining, and especially if they're on potassium wasting diuretics. So we're giving diuretics to get the fluid off. Like loop diuretics, not only do they kick the sodium out and then the water follows with it, but potassium goes out as well. If you lose too much potassium, it's a very important electrolyte in muscle function. This can be very bad for the patient. Too much potassium, too little potassium can affect the cardiovascular system very strongly. Know your potassium levels and your normal sodium levels. And think about, so if we wanted to tick back to overhydration for a second, water intoxication. So too much fluid, too much water coming in, it's been absorbed, it's in the vasculature. Water it's a very greedy solvent. It wants to put everything in suspension. Now, as we'll talk about osmosis here in a bit, or osmotic pressures, if say that this is the vasculature, all right, and we get too much water, so this is very dilute. Well, then the water, and this is the other spaces. The water will move to these other spaces to find things to put into balance so that the concentration equals out. Water is one thing that will cross the blood-brain barrier. And what happens, too much free water can cause your brain to become edematous and swell, which is great, but as we talked before, your carrying case for your brain is well fitted to your brain. Not much room for inflammation, not much room for expansion or anything extra. And as water crosses into the brain, causing it to become edematous, it expands or tries to expand within the skull and can thereby be damaged. Functions of water. We're talking a lot about water. What's it good for? It's the primary solvent in the body. Primary, the carrier of the solutions, if you will. It's primary compound in all body fluids. It's a great suspension agent because blood is not a solution, right? It's a suspension of red blood cells, white blood cells, proteins, all of these mixed up and carried in water. Helps regulate body temperature, as we've talked about already. Helps to regulate pH, so the acid-base balance. And also helps to regulate fluid pressures inside and outside the cells to control the movement in and out of cells for nutrients and waste products, right? Your brain, 90% water, right? Blood, 83% water. Your bones, 22% water. And any of you who are getting a little long in the tooth or have done horrible things to your knees over the years, yes, protects and moisturizes our joints to keep them from hurting and keep them moving smoothly. Keeps the lungs moist and pliable. Nutrients and oxygen into cells, wastes out of cells, provides protection. Water is very important to the continuation of life processes. Oh yes, assists or participates in or is the byproduct of chemical reactions in the body. Had a little fun with that one, sorry. I had to put the balance in. All right, next we have electrolytes. Electrolyte is a substance that dissociates into ions. So an electrolyte itself uh, we don't have a positive or negative charge, but when dissolved in water, it develops a positive or a negative charge, a plus or minus. Once it gets this electrical charge, then it can bond. So cats, positively charged. You got sodium. Ooh, note it's in red. It's fairly important. Potassium, though not in red, still fairly important. Calcium and magnesium, these are all cats. They're positively charged. Anions, negatively charged. So we got chlorine and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is a molecule in itself, which has an electrical charge. So sodium and chlorine, a positive and a negative. What would that make? Na, sodium, Cl, chlorine. Na positive, Cl negative, bind together. Then we have NaCl, or salt, regular old table salt, sodium chloride. Those of you who make it indigestion have probably had, at one time or another, sodium bicarbonate. Again, you have a positively charged ion and a negatively charged group together, sodium bicarbonate, NaHCO3, Alka-Seltzer. All right, before we kick on here. So electrolytes conduct energy, electrical energy, help to regulate fluid balance, help in the transport of nutrients in and out of the cells, themselves acting as the keys to the pump to move things in. Like we were talking with glucose before, where you have the sodium potassium pump and the glucose comes in, it's got its insulin on top of it, and the sodium and potassium flip as they move the glucose into the cell. Electrolytes support mental function, helps to regulate pH, very important, which is one of the reasons why they don't recommend just drinking straight water in the summertime, right? You're out in the heat, in the go, and you're a good person. You've got your water bottle with you, your reusable water bottle, right? Not plastic, and you're drinking your water and you're sweating and you're drinking your water. Well, keep in mind that you're just replacing the water. You are still, with that sweat, losing electrolytes, which will have to be replaced. Generally replaced in food, maybe replaced in Gatorade. My favorite. All right, fluid electrolyte balance is dependent on membrane permeability. Right? The osmolarity, okay, do they dissociate into ions? Okay. Electroneutrality, is there a positive and a negative? So if I have a negative sodium over here and a positive chloride over, sorry, that would be backwards, a positive sodium over here and a negative chloride over here, they are not electrically electroneutral, right? Positive and negative. And when the two come together and bond, then they become electroneutral. So you don't have the forces attracting or repelling. Monitor of fluid balance. Okay. Obviously, we're talking here fluid balance, really super important. Okay. So I's and O's and daily weights. All right, CNAs out there, be honest with yourselves. Right? Who rolled their eyes when it's like, hey, you didn't mark down this in the I's and O's? Or, hey, Bob hasn't had his daily weight yet. It's like 3 hours overdue. Folks, this is not just, well, it's not just, it's not busy work. Right? I&O and daily weight they're cheap, they're easy, they're really, well, not in the moment, but in the day, monitors of how the patient is doing maintaining their fluid balance. If Bob is in the hospital or in the nursing home and he is losing weight, and losing weight. All right, Merp. I have someone who wants to help me teach. Get down, cat. And she's going to now bite me because I just put her on the floor. Please, can we go back to in class? I want to go back on campus. So Bob's losing weight, right? And we look at the I's and O's and see that Bob's been putting out 1,500 mils a day in urine. Bob's only been taking in 500 mils worth of fluid in his diet. I wonder why Bob's losing weight. Or conversely, Bob's gaining weight. Bob's a heart failure patient, and Bob has gained 5 pounds in the last couple of days. And we see that his intake is normal, but his output has decreased. Okay, these are why we've got our daily weights and the intake and output monitoring to help us keep a close eye on these patients to help them maintain their fluid electrolyte balance. All right, transportation, because now we're talking, we've talked about electrolytes and we've talked about fluid and what's the big deal, how do they move? All right, so there's passive transport. These do not require energy to move. So you've got diffusion, osmosis, and filtration. All right. For diffusion, think of I take a glass of water and I take a Jolly Rancher and I drop that Jolly Rancher in the glass of water. Eventually, whatever color that Jolly Rancher is the color that the water is going to turn. That is through diffusion. Filtration. Think about filtration as you've got a cup of hot water and you have a tea bag. Or if you're me, you have a pot and coffee grounds and hot water to run through it. And you have a filter. Because as much as I enjoy coffee, I don't like spitting grounds. Right? Filtration. So what's happened there is the water has come through and it is coming through the ground beans and it's coming through that filter into the pot, and it is only letting the stuff that is small enough to go through the holes in the filter into my pot of coffee. All right, that's filtration. So some of it comes through, but not all. I still have a big wad of ground sitting up in the basket to toss. Osmosis is the movement of pure solvent. Pure solvent through a semi-permeable membrane. What am I talking about here? We'll get to that after we do active transport. Right? Active transport, so solute, solvent. Solvent, the fluid that the solution is made of. Solute, the dissolved pieces inside the solution. Okay, moves the solutes against the normal rules of concentration. So it could, active transport could move solute from an area of low concentration of solute to an area of high concentration of solute. Whereas with the passive transport, we don't have that movement against the concentration. Right? Normally things like to spread out and be relatively even. Permeability. How big the holes are in the membrane, how much will pass through. So in the case of the cell, right, we have the glucose molecule over here, and we have the water molecule over we have a membrane. The water molecule can pass through the cell membrane because it is small. The glucose molecule can't pass through the membrane without help, right? And that's where those pumps come in, and the insulin and the sodium potassium pump and the insulin moving glucose in so it can be burned. Water can generally pass through back and forth. So the ability of the membrane, is it a semi-permeable membrane? Is it a permeable membrane? Is it an impermeable membrane? So freely permeable, easy transfer from intravascular to interstitial. Selectively permeable, only some substances can get through. What can affect this? The size of the pores, osmotic pressure, the concentration on each side of the membrane. If the concentration of solute, right, this is so weird because it's not set up to mirror. If the, this one, yeah, there we go. All right, so if the concentration over here of solute is high and the concentration over here of solute is low, then fluid is through osmotic pressure is going to want to move from this low side to the high side to level things out. I got some pictures here that'll help this out a little bit more. Right, hydrostatic pressure can affect it. So let's say I have we'll take the coffee filter, for example, right? So if I stack a couple of coffee filters and I pour water into it, water comes through, but not as fast as it was just dropping straight. Right? Now, if I were to pressurize that top side and force the water through, water is going to come through faster. Hydrostatic pressure, the pressure on the wall of the membrane, can affect how permeable a membrane is and how fast things flow through. Right? Electrical changes, the solubility, of course. If the molecule is insoluble, it's not going to pass through a membrane very well. And the size. Remember back to my analogy just a little bit ago. You got the big glucose molecule here, and you got the little water molecule. Little water molecule is going to go through a lot more membranes than the big glucose molecules. All right, diffusion and osmosis. Wha-bam. Diffusion, right? The movement of solvent and solute across the semi-permeable membrane. Okay, so not only does the water move across the filter, but so does the coffee grounds. Okay, those are crappy coffee filters. So here you go, semi-permeable membrane, right? So here, as I say, you got a high solute concentration and a low solute concentration, and fluid moves across, solutes move across, and it becomes balanced, okay? Makes sense? Osmosis. Pure solvent across the semi-permeable membrane. So just the solvent, none of the solute, all right? So we have a higher level here, low concentration of solute. Lower level here, high concentration of solute. Right? With osmotic pressure, an osmotic membrane, the fluid moves across, the solvent moves across until the concentrations on each side of that membrane are the concentration of solvent to solute, solvent to solute, are equal. So whereas in diffusion, the level stayed the same on each side, with osmosis, on the other side of an osmotic membrane, you may have the level or the pressure increase inside there. When you think about fluid balance and red blood cells, this is one thing that can cause cells to burst, is you have fluid moving into the cell because the concentration of the bloodstream is so low, overhydrated, and fluid moves into the cell, which can then cause it to swell. And at some point, it stops swelling and bursts. And for those of you who like Venn diagrams, all right, diffusion. Again, solvent and solute move to equalize the concentration. Osmosis. So it's a freely permeable membrane over here with diffusion. Osmosis, only the solvent particles move, not the solute. Both of them work to equalize the concentration of the two solutions. In the case of the cell, the solution intracellular and the solution extracellular to equalize the concentration. Filtration. All right. Now we're going to start getting into some vascular goodies here. So here we have two capillaries. These are two ends of the same capillary, let's say, because they are. So on the arterial side, over here, arterial, the arteriole, the small arteries, and they turn into capillaries, and then they become venules, and then so the pressure is higher on the arterial side. The hydrostatic pressure, which is causing force on the walls of the capillary, which is forcing fluid out. And along with that fluid goes the nutrients and whatever else is being, electrolytes, nutrients, all that are being forced out into the interstitial space to be drawn into the cells. Now, as it passes that point, then, so that's hydrostatic pressure forcing it out. Passes that point, then the pressure, both hydrostatic and osmotic, because it's forcing water out here, it is increasing the concentration. I'm pointing at the screen like you can see this. As it is forcing water out here, it is increasing the concentration of the bloodstream, which then increases osmotic pressure on the other side to draw fluids back in. And with those fluids come the waste products. Okay? Here we go. So at the arterial end of the capillary, blood pressure exceeds the interstitial pressure. Increased hydrostatic pressure forces out. On the other side of the capillary bed, the blood pressure, both osmotic and hydrostatic, is less than the interstitial space draws fluid back in. That is how capillaries work to get the stuff out and get the good stuff out and the waste products back in. ABGs. Okay. ABGs are a little bit fun. They're also a little bit headache inducing, literally in some cases. Why do we care about arterial blood gases? They're measured in the lab to detect compensation, and an ABG can tell you what is going on inside the patient's body that you may not be able to visualize. Okay. pH, specific gases, namely CO2 and O2, right? Bicarbonate. These are all things that are measured in the ABG. And, big feet. Sorry, I'm perched on the arm of a couch here, and it's becoming a little uncomfortable. Just about worn this couch out, or at least the arm. Okay, so it can tell you what's going on inside the body. And there are a lot of things that can affect your acid-base balance. The ABG is going to give you a window as to what is happening inside the body. So major major mechanisms, right? Kidneys, they excrete ammonia, right? And you also get bicarbonate. So we're packing up because pH is potential hydrogen, all right? So we're trying to balance out the hydrogen ions. And then the lungs, the other organ that helps with acid-base balance, eliminates CO2. Okay, first, well, not the first rule, but CO2 equals acid. If your CO2 levels go up, your pH will go down. CO2 dissolved in water becomes carbonic acid. Okay, it's right there in the name, right? So increased levels of CO2 can cause acidosis. Decreased levels of CO2 can cause alkalosis. These are respiratory causes. Kidney dysfunction, increased excretion of ammonia, or increased excretion of bicarbonate, or decreased excretion of either one, can cause acidosis and alkalosis. Remember, we're talking about homeostasis, dynamic process happening all the time. You don't even know it's working until it doesn't. Right? Our pH buffers, we have bicarbonate and carbon dioxide. Respiratory system will help to regulate CO2. You may retain CO2 to combat an alkalotic state, or you may blow off extra CO2 to combat an acidotic state. We began talking about this in first term of the respiratory system, as I recall. All right. Oh, cellular respiration. Where have I heard that before? All right. Oh, weird. Weird. I don't think that I have ever showed you guys this particular equation. Right now, it's greatly simplified because there's a lot more going on with the production of energy. But to our basics here, C6H12O6 plus 6O2 equals 6CO2 and 6H2O. And then remember, you've got energy and heat. Right? CO2, we blow off as we breathe, makes the trees happy, right? Plants like CO2, we like O2. We blow off the CO2, plants take that, utilize the carbon, turn off or put out oxygen. Hey, we all continue to breathe, right? Us and the plants. Bicarbonate excreted by the kidneys. So bicarbonate, okay. So to give you a little eyeball on this, so I mentioned earlier, sodium bicarbonate, upset stomach, acid stomach, right? The sodium bicarbonate buffers the acid, right? Helps to sop up that acid, and so this is excreted by the kidneys. If the CO2 rises or the bicarb drops, we become our internal environment, let's say that. We become acidic, right, or acidotic. If the CO2 drops or the bicarb increases, then we become basic or alkalotic. I don't think I've ever said this before either. Remember that life as we know it exists within a narrow window of temperature and pH. It's because of the chemical processes that temperature and pH supports, okay? We run slightly alkalotic. Our pH, as you see down here, neutral pH is 7. If we reach 7, cellular processes are not happening. Well, they're not happening as they should, okay? So we normally run 7.35 to 7.45. Stomp, 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 okay? Good number to know. 7.35 to 7.45. If we go above that, so let's say we hit 7.46, then we are becoming more alkaline or alkalotic. If we hit 7.34, we are sitting here on the basic side, or sorry, the acidic side, right? Alkalotic over here, 7.46, acidic or acidotic, 7.34 down here. It's not a very large range for pH. Think acidosis, or acid as a car battery, right? Have any of you ever spilled the sulfuric acid from a car battery on yourself? What happens? Tissue gets burned. Conversely, alkalosis, so alkaline, drain cleaner. Okay? If you have ever gotten drain cleaner on your hands and not been able to wash it off fast enough, you see that what happens there is tissue damage. Right? Both ends of the spectrum will cause damage to the tissues, different mechanisms, but they become the same thing. They're both chemical burns. So less than 7.35 acidosis, greater than 7.45 alkalosis. Respiratory fix for this is CO2. Right? CO2 plus water equals H2CO3, or carbonic acid, which lowers the pH, making it acidic. Renal, right? Bicarbonate buffers the H plus, or hydrogen, you know, the chemical symbol H, that's positive. So it buffers that up, raises the pH. Okay. So if I was at 7.34 and my kidneys excreted some bicarbonate to buffer up some of that potential hydrogen, then or to create some potential hydrogen, then my pH increases. Hope I've made that as clear as mud. Oh, here's Pat. Let's look at Pat. What's going on with Pat today? Respiratory acidosis is what's going on with Pat today. Okay, respiratory acidosis. What can cause it? Decreased respiratory stimulus, drugs, hypoventilation. All right. So hypoventilation triggered by, let's just say, CNS depression from opiates. Right? So the drugs cause depression of the CNS, decreases respiratory stimulus. Right? The body is not, you're not blowing off CO2. You're not blowing off enough CO2 because your respiratory rate is low. If you're not blowing off the CO2, it's staying in the bloodstream. CO2 equals acid, right? CO2 equals acid, so therefore the acid builds up, you become acidotic, pH drops. COPD, same reason. Obstructive pulmonary disease impairs the gas exchange in the lungs, can increase the acidity, which decreases the pH. Very often you will find, especially patients with severe COPD, is they have adapted and they run, if you're to do a blood gas on a COPD patient, they have a tendency to run to the very low end of normal or just slightly acidic. Pneumonia, again, impairing, are we seeing a trend with this? Impairing gas exchange, impairing the exchange of oxygen for CO2. Atelectasis, the collapse, again, collapse of the alveoli, again, impairing gas exchange. Let's look at the effects. Headache, drowsiness, dizziness, disorientation. Right? This is for acidosis. Dyspnea, difficulty breathing, which may be a cause as well as a symptom. Right? You're going to see changes in respiratory rate. So consider that if, let's say, in compensation for this, so you're in an acidotic state, could be more likely it'll be metabolic acidosis that would be this. Your body is in an acidotic state. This says, hey, I got to get rid of some CO2. How's it going to get rid of the CO2? Right? Increase respiratory rate, increase the depth, increase that exchange of oxygen for CO2 to blow some off. Dysrhythmias, hypotension, right, due to the effects on the vasculature. Vasodilation, causing the hypotension. Hyperkalemia, increased potassium levels. Ooh, that's a little scary. And weakness. That's all respiratory acidosis there. Oh, flip side of the coin. We do a lot of flip sides in this class. Causes. Weird. Hyperventilation. It's respiratory. So hyperventilation. Respiratory rate is increased. You're blowing off more CO2 than you really want to. Effects. Okay, so let's take a couple here. So we might have some tachycardia, lethargy and confusion, lightheadedness, potential seizures. Okay. Blood pressure could be hypotensive, could be normotensive. Right? And we look over here, respiratory acidosis, we have hyperkalemia, respiratory alkalosis, hypokalemia. Flip sides, flip sides of the coin again. Over here, too much potassium. Over here, too little potassium. And respiratory acidosis, or alkalosis, I'm sorry, cause numbness or tingling in the extremities. Flip sides of the coin. Oh, I wonder what we could be going for now. Oh, metabolic alkalosis. Okay. We just had respiratory alkalosis. Let's hit metabolic alkalosis. Causes. Okay, NG suction. Prolonged vomiting. Right? Both of these are removing GI content, stomach content, highly acidic. Body's going to replace that. Okay. Decreasing, or I should say increasing the potential hydrogen. Thiazide diuretics, they have a potential side effect of metabolic alkalosis with their effect on the kidneys. Steroids, or weirdly enough, bicarbonate overdose. Yes, in fact, you can overdose on bicarbonate. Things are times when this might happen in code situations. If bicarbonate is being given to counteract an acidotic state in a code, and too much is given or is given inappropriately, we can have a bicarbonate overdose, which will take them from an acidotic state to an alkalotic state. Oops. Or you will often find this in your older patients in long-term care facilities, where they stomach issues, right? Often in response or as a side effect to medication and sour stomach, and they keep popping their little Tums, right? Okay, well, what is Tums? Tums is calcium carbonate. It's a buffer. Or feeling bad and drinking lots of sodium bicarbonate to try to get the acid buffered up in the stomach. Again, patients can overdose themselves, or we can do it um, with medications. So let's see what our effects are. Confusion, dysrhythmias, weakness, cramps, tetany, hyperactive reflexes, convulsions, and hypokalemia. Hypokalemia. Okay, alkalosis, hypokalemia. Metabolic acidosis. What could it cause? Shock. Ketoacidosis. Back to diabetes again. Severe diarrhea. Or impaired renal function. Impaired renal function. Let's see. So kidneys produce ammonia. Okay, well, if my kidneys aren't functioning well, are they producing the ammonia? Oh, wait. They also produce bicarbonate. And if they're not functioning, they're not producing the bicarbonate. All right. We don't have the bicarbonate to buffer up that acidity, and well, pooey, here we are again with metabolic acidosis. Just as too much bicarbonate here, too little here, can cause the flip side of the coin. So let's look at our effects. So headache, lethargy, coma, dysrhythmias. We're going to skip this for just a second. Nausea and diarrhea, abdominal discomfort. Oh, look, here we are again, flip sides of the coin with potassium. Hypo for alkalosis, hyper for acidosis. Deep, rapid respirations. Why would my patient who is in metabolic acidosis, why would they have deep and rapid respirations? Give you a second to think about that. Now yell it at the screen. I couldn't hear you, but so think about it. Acidosis, CO2 equals acid. Metabolic cause of acidosis, the body is saying, hey, I got to get rid of some of this CO2 to reduce the amount of acid in the body, right? I got to get this CO2 out because CO2 equals acid. So I'm going to breathe faster and deeper, trying to maximize the loss of CO2 through the respiratory system. You see how those two are working out there, metabolic versus respiratory. So I'm going to tick back here a couple of pieces. All right. So respiratory acidosis. Talked about decreased respiratory stimulus causing hypoventilation. All right. Or anything that's impairing gas exchange. Another piece that could come into this would be living in a high CO2 environment, or our current environment where everybody and their mother's dog is now wearing a surgical mask, and probably doing it improperly if the truth be told. Wearing these masks, and they're not used to it, and what are they? And the mask does not fit well. It's not well designed. What are they doing? They're rebreathing CO2. So instead of blowing off that CO2, they're breathing it back in, which then raises the level of CO2 in the bloodstream, decreases pH. Let's go down to respiratory alkalosis here for a second. Causes hyperventilation. So who has ever seen this? Who knows somebody that hyperventilates or has been, the medics showed up and they gave the person a paper bag to breathe into. What are they doing there? They're trying to prevent respiratory alkalosis. By breathing into the paper bag, they are rebreathing some of that CO2 that they have been blowing off, causing an alkalotic state. They're rebreathing that CO2, and that also helps to trigger their respiratory rate to slow down. And looks really funny. So, flip sides of the coin. Metabolic and respiratory, flip sides of that coin too, is that if the cause is metabolic, the respiratory system is going to kick in to help level things out. If the cause is, got respiratory cause, metabolic compensation. Metabolic cause, respiratory compensation. So your patient, going back to diabetes again, in metabolic acidosis, in diabetic ketoacidosis, one of the things that you would be looking for and very likely to see in a patient with DKA is deep and rapid respirations as they're trying to get rid of CO2 to help balance the pH. Does it make sense now? Fingers crossed, happy butts. All right. So, little basics on ABG interpretation. We don't go super deep down the rabbit hole because you could go down this for weeks and still not hit everything, okay? In general, looking at the arrows, okay? So get out a piece of paper, write down Rome. Respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. So let's look at this first line, respiratory acidosis. When I'm talking a respiratory opposite, it's because the abnormals are going in different directions. Okay, actually that matched there. Okay, so pH down, acidotic. The PaCO2, the amount of CO2 in the blood, up. Right? If the pH is down and the PaCO2 is up, you've got respiratory acidosis. If the pH is up and trying to make these match with the screw it. You try it sometime, not in front of a mirror, okay? Respiratory alkalosis, the pH is up because they're alkalotic. The PaCO2 is down. Now, in both of these, the bicarb's normal, right? Now we hit, so Rome, respiratory opposite. The arrows go in the opposite directions, right? Metabolic equal. In metabolic acidosis, the pH is down because they're acidotic, right? The bicarb, which is the abnormal, is down because bicarb is metabolic, right? CO2 is respiratory. Bicarb is metabolic. They're going in the same directions. The pH is down, the bicarb is down. Metabolic alkalosis, the pH is up, and the bicarb is up. Rome, respiratory opposite, metabolic equal. That's a quick way to look at an ABG result and say, what system do I need to be looking at, right? Because if it's a metabolic system, all right, well, what's happening inside? If it's respiratory, respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, what's my patient breathing like? Why are they not exchanging CO2 for oxygen in a manner that they should be? Does that make sense? Now, we're almost down to the end here. Risk for fluid and electrolyte imbalances. Infants, okay, they're juicy, right? More body fluid than adults. That's why they take longer to cook. Extracellular fluid is lost more easily than intracellular fluid. That's okay, that's how it works. Part of this is due to immature kidney function. So parents, raise your hands. I just visualized that. When when your children were in diapers? Were you ever amazed at how one little thing could pee so many times a day? Right? Immature kidney function, they're not done baking when they're born. Kidneys are still developing, right? They cannot yet concentrate urine. So immature kidney function places them at a higher risk for dehydration. Right? And then they're not being able to go to the sink and get a glass of water on their own also raises their risk for dehydration. Elder population, right? Intracellular fluid levels decrease, still shrink a little bit. Right? Thirst sensation declines. Muscle tissue turns into fat. They're on a lot of medications often. Now, obviously, this is not true for every single elderly patient on the planet. These are generalizations to help us guide our nursing care and assessments. Okay? So, medications can cause loss of fluid and electrolytes. Health conditions that require these medications. Circulatory and renal disorders can cause fluid retention. So circulatory, like heart failure, renal disorders like chronic kidney failure may cause fluid retention. Okay, note these are imbalances. So if I have an increase, testing purposes, reading test question purposes. So if I have a balance and I have a disturbance to that balance, okay, and it's up here a little bit, right? All right, I have let's just say I have an electrolyte disturbance. My potassium level is a little bit high. And then I receive a potassium sparing diuretic, which causes fluid to be lost, but potassium to be retained. I still have an electrolyte disturbance, but it is an increase in the electrolyte disturbance. Okay, you're going to see this in some funky NCLEX test questions. So think about, if something can cause an increase in the electrolyte disturbance, right? Be looking for that in test questions. Circulatory and renal disorders can not only cause a fluid or electrolyte disturbance, but the treatments may increase that disturbance. This last one, okay, virtual foot stomp 3 times. Age-related decline in renal function. Remember that we are machines. We are amazing machines, but we are machines. We are composed of systems, and those systems get old and wear out over time. Normal age-related decline in renal function is something we have to consider. A patient who is in their 20s and in perfect health does not carry the same fluid and electrolyte imbalance risks that a patient in their 80s with several health conditions runs. And then this guy again, just because he amuses me. All right. That, guys, what'd I do? There it is. That, guys, is the end of chapter 17. Read into it. There's going to be some of this on the final. And also, we will be revisiting some of these things when we're talking about neurological and cardiovascular in the coming weeks. Until then, I'm going to upload this to YouTube, send you out a little notification, and have a weekend.